Two.
Two of these. This is your third. Okay, we're recording, and I'm with Eric. Eric was on episode 35 and episode 65. I looked him up while we were talking. So Eric, introduce yourself a second to everybody if they haven't listened to those two episodes.
Okay, well, I'm Eric Heuser. I'm a French Canadian with a German name that's trying to write in English. So be patient with me, please.
That's my favorite introduction. That's amazing. Yeah, and you sent me two pieces, and we're gonna look at both of them.
Yeah.
And these are from the same novel we did the other episode from. These are just later chapters in that novel. So
exactly.
Yeah, so I love working on the same thing. That makes me happy because I know all the characters. Okay, so tell me. I have really good things to say, and then there's some things I want to work with you on. I'm going to share my screen. And while I share my screen, I'm going to warn YouTube watchers. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, Eric and I sometimes have a rough connection. We decided it's because the Canadian border is filtering the call. So we sometimes have a rough connection and we freeze a little bit. So if there's a pause on the podcast, I'm going to try to take it out. But if YouTube, I don't know how to edit video. This is still a problem. So if there's a pause in the YouTube conversation, you guys are just stuck. So just hang in there. It'll stop. Anyway. Okay. So let's talk about the piece. So talk to me about, I'm scanning it down like this because you have clearly written a dialogue-centric first draft, which is fantastic. And it's really good. Your character voice is really strong. I want to talk about the emotional flow, but your emotions are good. You're modulating voices really well. Talk to me about the process of writing this a little bit.
Okay, well, what I do when I start writing is I look at the different steps that I want to achieve. So I use different techniques. There's the three-story method that I use.
The conflict, choice, and consequences.
There's the story grid that I use. So I try to look at, what's the inciting incident? What's the first thing that happens? And after that, I'm trying to put in some complications. And then there's a decision that the protagonist needs to make. And then there's the conclusion. So I always start this way, and I build dialogue around that. Now, since we've been working together, all of my scenes are firstly dialogue based. So that's the first thing I do.
Nice. Have you given this, after you wrote out the dialogue, have you given this a second pass yet?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So there's a couple things, like I said, your character voices are great. Your first scene is this interrogation scene where the character's being interrogated. I'm going to talk through the beats real quick because there's two things I specifically want to work with you. One is setting and scenery. So we got to talk about adding a little more scenery and a little more setting to what's going on. And I'm going to talk to you about like how I would recommend you go about that after you have a draft like this, because I don't think you should try to write it. Your dialogue first draft is going so well. I don't think you should try to write it. I don't think you should try to write the scenery on your first pass, but on your second or third pass, I want to talk to you about where to find the places to pause a little bit and put in more scenery and more setting to orient the reader. So we'll talk about that. And then I also want to talk about your emotional flow and the tone, and how to transition from one emotion to the next. So to get there, let's go through the beats of the two chapters real quick. It starts in an interrogation in a police station, and David is being interrogated by Claire, which interrogation scenes are like, these are my favorite scenes to write because they're back and forth, they're quick, they're heightened emotion, there's a lot of gameplay that goes on. It's so fun. And you wrote a really great interrogation scene. You can see, she's barking questions, demanding things. The cop is barking questions and demanding things. He's giving these kind of half answers. He's a little nervous. He doesn't really know why he's there. It's just a really nice back and forth. She builds to frustration, and then she gets pulled out of the room by her boss. And once she gets pulled out of a room by her boss, the boss comes in and starts dropping some really heavy emotional bombs on him. The chapter ends with him getting pulled out of the room by this fairy and pulled into another world. So we've got urban fantasy going, but all that to say, to focus on the interrogation, you've got really great beats, you've got really good flow, there's really good variety of what's going on. It's a really nice, well done conversation between these three people. So great job with that. In the second piece, we have the conversation between the fairy and David. And this piece is a ton of world building.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I want to take them separately. And in the first one, I want to talk, because the first one, we'll talk about scene building, but you don't need as much. In the second one, we need to talk about a lot more scene building because they're in this other world. So we got to give the reader more of a picture of it.
Yep.
So that's just an overview of where I'm going. Is there anything else you want to talk about that I didn't mention?
No. The
Okay.
only thing I want to mention is the two characters in the first scene. You know, there's the detective that's there, and there's the captain.
Yeah.
So the detective becomes like too emotional in there.
Yeah.
And I'm putting in a red herring in there.
Okay. What's the red herring?
Okay. I want, because we're going to see Claire a lot in the book. She's going to be chasing him. And
Gotcha.
I want the readers to believe that she's part of the bad guys.
Okay.
But she's not.
Okay.
She's acting this way because one of the people that was killed that day was a woman she was in love with.
Okay. Nice.
So that's her emotional
gotcha. So that's why she's getting so heated.
Journey that she's there. So she's really frustrated because, yeah. And the captain is actually the one that seems like a nice guy, but he's the one working with the bad guys.
Okay. That's good to know as we come into talking about it.
Yeah, that's why I want to mention it right away.
Yeah. So your opening line, David was sitting in an interrogation room at the police station. So it's okay to keep this. I want you to think about when you start a scene, like you're in a box, right? You're like trapped in this box. You as the reader are trapped in this box, and the box is full of smoke. And we're just going to, as you, the author, unveil things, we're going to pull the smoke back a little bit. So here you can get away with this very simple description because most of your readers are going to have in their head what an interrogation room looks like, right? So the smoke clears and the interrogation room is like, okay, I get there's a table, there's two chairs, and David's sitting there. And then he says, "Am I under arrest?" He asked Claire Kowalski. So the smoke has again cleared around this woman, Claire Kowalski. Just like the interrogation room, though, because you've given me no details of who she is, I imagine my image of Claire Kowalski, which may be nothing like yours, because my image of Claire Kowalski connects to the woman Kowalski that I used to know, who was like 65 and a little overweight and really liked eating donuts, right? Like, so I'm picturing, when I read these lines until I get further down, I'm picturing this, like, you know, kind of grandmotherly old lady. So like, all of that to say, understanding that like your reader comes into this with no idea, right? Like, especially the opening of the scene or the opening of a setting, your reader's kind of in a mystery. right? They have no idea what to see in their mind's eye. So we want to give them a
Yeah, it's
couple.
because
Oh
we
yeah.
saw Claire in other chapters before, other scenes. So this is scene 10, I believe, and we've seen her in scene like 7,
Yeah.
8, and 9.
So we need to, even though we know who she is, right? Like that, you're right. Like my example of like, oh, it's an elderly grandmother.
Yeah.
I still don't know where she is in the room, what's happening in the room. I don't know how to visualize her. Is she standing or sitting?
Okay.
Is she holding a clipboard or not? Is her hand on her gun? Is she like leaning forward to look him in the eye? Or is she walking around in the corner, right? Like the reason we need these textures is to give the reader this like visual of where to start in the conversation. We don't want to go overboard, right? Like we don't want like 3 chapters describing, the texture of the walls. Like we don't want like 4 paragraphs describing something. We just need a couple lines. Like David was sitting in an interrogation room at the police station and it was way dirtier than he thought it would be. Right. Or like the crumpled coffee cups in the corner told him that this place definitely didn't have maid service. Right. Like I'm adding that last little detail there to tell the reader, hey, this is how David feels about being here. Right. Yeah. David was sitting in the interrogation room at the police station, watching the camera, watching him, wondering who was on the other side. Right. Like, or David, placed his hands on the table, trying not to grip the sides, hoping not to look anxious, right? Like something that gives us just a nice detail that gives us some insight into how he's feeling in this space, and giving us some kind of body language up front from Claire to let us know where she is, right? Like, and think of this as in movie land, they call it the establishing shot. We need the establishing shot for our mind's eye to tell us like, okay, here's where things are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. The only time we want to really because there are times where you want voice out of the fog, meaning you drop your character in a box, the box is full of fog, and rather than seeing anything in their mind's eye first, the first thing that happens is a voice rings out. Right. We only want to do that when we're absolutely emphasizing the voice and what's being said. And we want what's being said to have a impact on the reader's imagination. So here, instead, we want to make sure that we're getting that like setting. So I want you to put a pin in that. Actually, no, let's talk about it here. So I said here, we want it up front just to give us a little bit of setting for what's going on. Right. If we come to the end of the chapter, and we get to the end of the chapter, he's running towards the parking lot, and he can see an orb making its way toward the boulevard on the vacant lot. He sped a few more times as he reached the field and followed it into the woodlands at the other end. This is all fine, right? Like I have a general idea of what running through a parking lot is like. I have a general idea of when the parking lot leads to woods. Like I get that. As he entered the woods, he stopped amazed by an intense aroma of the trees. He also noticed how vivid the colors were. He took a deep breath and soothed his senses like a good night's sleep. Welcome to Mithril, the voice said. So this is a great ending to the piece. And you've given it to this scene, right? Like it's a nice transition. It holds some good, and you've given me a little bit vague description. I know that like the colors got a little bit brighter and he's smelling some things that he didn't smell. We come into the next scene, the top of the next scene, and we're right into a small humanoid creature was flying in front of his face. I'm David. Hi, David. I'm Olia. What's Olia? And now you're right into this conversation between the two things. How does he feel about that? Right? Like, how does that make him feel? What's happened to the world around him? Later, we're going to find out that like the world that he just left is actually kind of a mirage or like an image that is like transparent in the world that he's in. You got to start giving us those details right here.
Okay.
because we are going to experience this conversation through David, right? Like we're empathizing. David's our vehicle character for both of these scenes.
Yeah.
So we need to know what he's feeling in this new world. He got a little bit sleepy. We need him looking around. We need him trying to touch some things. We need him like looking, examining this creature flying in front of him, right? Like, because don't trust my imagination so much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And the reason that's important is because if there are important details, like for example, later in the chapter, you talk about the world being transparent. That's an important detail. If you spend a page allowing me to imagine things the way I'm imagining them, like if you trust my imagination, and then you pull the rug out from under me in a page, you're like, no, it's actually like this. I'm going to be angry as a reader.
Okay.
I'm gonna be like, that's not fair. You can't do that. Right. Like, so we need the scene set for us. We need like the inside the box. And with this chapter, I want to talk a little bit about how to do that. So you got where I'm at so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's perfect.
You got a really cool world, right? Like, and I want to see it. I want to be a part of it. So
okay.
We'll go back to the other chapter in a minute to talk about like the emotional flow. But since we're talking about setting, I want to talk about how it works in this chapter. Because this is a like trope chapter in a good way, right? Like this is a chapter that fantasy readers expect, which is we're going to have a conversation about the world. Right? Like it's a classic Dresden's File chapter where he's talking to the fairy that brings him pizza. Right. And as he's talking to the fairy that brings him pizza, the only purpose the conversation actually serves is to give us information about the world that we need for the book. He's gonna be like, what werewolves do you know that have moved into town? And the fairy's like eating the pizza. He's like, let me go. I don't want to tell you. Right. Like, and it's this like, and finally the fairy's gonna be like, this is what I know. Or he's gonna go to the basement and his apartment, and he's gonna talk to like the spirit that lives in the skull. Right. Like he's going to have a fight with like the spirit that lives in the skull. And finally, the spirit that lives in the skull is going to give him some kind of knowledge about what needs to happen in the world. So this is that same kind of chapter where he's going to have this conversation with this fairy. And the point of the conversation is to connect us to the world, right? Like connect the reader to the world. And here's where it gets hard. That's not what keeps us reading. Right? Like that's your goal as the author.
Yeah.
But what keeps us reading is the entertainment value of watching the two characters interact. That's what keeps us reading. So talk to me a little bit about your fairy. How do you want the reader to feel about her? It is a her, right?
Yeah, it is her.
Yeah, it is a her. Okay.
I don't want her to be a fairy like we usually see. Okay. She's very powerful and she doesn't make magic or anything, but she has, like all the fairies in this book, she has a screech that's very, very powerful.
Gotcha.
It could bring down walls. It could destroy almost anything. So I want like to reinvent the fairy. And that's one of the things I'm doing in here, you know, like she's motherly to him.
Okay.
She loves him because she's seen him for all his life. She wants to protect him, but she's able to be tough with him, you know?
Okay. So this kind of like caring toughness, she also seems very playful with him. Is that intentional?
Yeah, she's always playful.
Okay. So playful, but tough and motherly. That's great. So I think that's definitely coming across. When we talk about setting the scene, every long conversation like this it has segments to it. Meaning there's places where there's changes in the emotional tone or there's changes in the topic, right? So let's just take this as an example. Hi, hi, David. She introduces herself. She teases him a little bit. He says, "Are you an alien?" And she's, teases him for that. And then the joke about the parrot was great. She says, "Look at me, 12 berries tall, pointy ears and wings. Obviously, I'm a troll." A troll? No, I'm a fairy, dum dum. A fairy? And you're obviously a parrot. That was really funny. It made me laugh.
Yeah.
Like so nicely done. So they're talking about what she is. And then she says, "Did you hit your head or something?" And he says, "Actually, that would explain it." And then she says, "Okay, let's start over." Right? So, "Okay, let's start over" is the end of this first segment and the beginning of the next segment. Right? You can feel a pause in the conversation when you read it all the way through. Right? Okay, let's start over. You can kind of feel like, all right, we're getting going. So in between these two utterances, actually, that would explain a lot. Okay, let's start over. This is the perfect place for you to give us a sentence or two about the world that he's in and how he's experiencing it.
Okay.
Because it's not going to interrupt. The key to adding setting and scenery is don't interrupt the flow of the conversation. Don't sacrifice the energy that comes from that back and forth, right? The back and forth, you've got this great one-on-one conversation where you've got two characters going back and forth, and you're doing some things really, really well, right? You're not using a lot of he said, she said. You're only using it to like actually pace out how they're talking, which is great. Like you're using it to impact what we call the cadence, the like sentence structure of their voice, which is awesome, right? Like, and you're not filling it up with a ton of like body language or movement, but it is very sparse. So this like, "What are you, a parrot? What, did you hit your head or something?" Actually, that would explain a lot. He said as he rubbed his head and looked around, everything seemed transparent. He reached out to touch a tree that he felt like he had just passed and his hand moved through it, right? Like, or whatever. Like, this is a place where you can like give us two sentences like that so that we can start to experience the world with him. Inside that box, you start to reveal a little bit more about this world that he's in.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. That's great.
Yeah. And the key is to look for those segments, right? So that's the first segment. We'll get another one here. She says, she starts explaining his family, and he's like, "Pleasure to meet you, princess." And she's like, "Princess? Why are you calling me a princess?" And they start talking about like the different worlds. And sorry, we're not talking about his family yet. We're talking about the different worlds. And she's like, "Does it stink here, like Tara?" "Stink? My world stinks." And then she explains that the world is strong enough to stink. And then he says, "I feel like Vinnie Barbarino right now," right? Here, you've got this long paragraph where she's going to explain something. That's another clear sign that you're ending one segment and moving into another.
Okay.
Right? When a character has like a soliloquy, when they're like, "All right, let me get this down for you," right? That's a place to pause and to go, "Okay, let me give a little more detail." And there's two things I want you giving here. One is scenery, like giving us orientation, the setting, and think about also, how does David feel about this moment, about everything he's just learned? Don't tell us though, give us body language that shows how he's feeling.
Okay.
So this next, like, you have it here. "I feel like Vinnie Areno," David said, grabbing his head. That I'd want you to take that grabbing his head up and put it up first, like lead with the body language. Grabbing his head, David took a second look around and smelled the air to see if he could smell the stink that she mentioned. And it tanged his nostrils, or like, she was right. This place was sweeter than before. And then he can say like, "I feel like Vinnie Barbarino." Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I
So
like it.
finding the breaks in those segments so that we keep the energy moving, and then but still insert some world building to keep that world being entertaining. And like I said before, people are coming to this for the world building. So actually, This is a weird example, but my son and I were talking about it. My 18-year-old son and I were talking about it yesterday in the car. We were talking about a movie. We were talking about the cartoon Madagascar and how neither of us liked Ben Stiller's performance in Madagascar. And we started talking about what do we like about Ben Stiller, because we like him and things like Meet the Parents and all these other, Dodgeball, all these other movies he's been in, Night at the Museum, even. What do we like about it? And we're like, we like the explosive moments of him, where like things build to the place where he's about to pop. That's when he's really funny. And he never did that in the movie we don't like. And so as we were talking about that, this comes to mind, in that like Ben Stiller has this gift of like getting a ton of information and a ton of stuff across to us as a viewer in a very entertaining way, because we're watching that energy build and that emotional energy build. The scene my son brought up was the scene where he's in Meet the Parents, where he's on the plane and he's like in this big climax state, and he has a fight with a stewardess about, can you say bomb on a plane, right? Like, it's hysterical. But it's the build, it's that emotional build to that moment where he pops, and that's what we love, right? Like, so your fairy's not going to pop, but there is this back and forth, and what you're doing is you're ebbing to this like fairy teasing, fairy teasing, fairy teasing, fairy explaining, and there's a little bit of relief and then confusion as David ramps up again with another question, right? So this chapter has this kind of like wave feel to it, where it's like teasing, fun, I sound like a robot, right? Like, and then, which is a joke you make earlier in the thing, and then the fairy finally explains, and David has a moment of acceptance, and then confusion, and comes back up. So we want to keep that feel. That's the trope for these kind of scenes, is that like build and then let the reader off the hook to breathe for a second, and then build again and let the reader off to breathe for a second. You could do that with tension and like intensity. You could do it with horror, but you're doing it with comedy, right? Like for you, it's funny. And then you kind of crash down into like, let me reveal this stuff about the world. So you got to find where those waves crash, and then stretch out that moment of confusion by giving that scene building and explaining how David feels in that moment, and then you can ramp back up in the energy of the conversation. Does that make sense?
Okay, it does.
What I don't want you to do is to start interrupting this great flow that you have, that's going back and forth between the two of them, and in the energy that's building, by like throwing in a ton of unnecessary body language or throwing in like descriptions of the leaves that are falling around. Know that like anytime you get into that prose, you start to slow down the pace. And so we want to make sure when we're crashing, we're actually slowing that down. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So here's another one. And this one's a little bit different because it's an emotional shift and we need to sit in it. So again, like the first two I talked to you about were changes in setting, in segments, right? Like the topic was changing. This one is that more of that wave crashing emotional shift. So I feel like Benny Barbarino, that was the kid you played with at Saxton. He was dumber than a Rubelon sand snail. How do you know that? I was keeping an eye on you. Why? Your grandfather asked me to keep an eye on me. Well, not exactly. To keep an eye on Sylvia. And she explains that. She's like, I always thought it applied to you too. And he says, you were watching me my whole life. That's a big emotional expression, right? Like something that he's going to struggle with to comprehend. So that's a crash. You're watching me my whole life. I'm not hovering over your head, right? But right here in that you're watching me my whole life, we need some body language.
Okay.
We need to know how he feels. We need to get that like emotional texture here to make it a little bit deeper and richer. So, because remember, he's our vehicle. We're experiencing the scene through his eyes. So we got to get this moment here where he's like, you were watching me my whole life. Because is it nonchalant? Is he like, everybody watches me, I'm the best? Or is it intense? Like I'm intensely uncomfortable right now. You're watching me my whole life. even when I was in the shower by myself, right? Like, or is it like, confusion? You've been watching my whole life, right? This is then going to ramp up to another emotional shift where she reveals that she watched his mother die and didn't do anything.
Yeah.
This is even a bigger emotional shift. We got to sit here for a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a big thing. There needs to be some more back and forth. So right now you have, I know I saw everything. You saw and you couldn't help. Couldn't you? David stared at her with rage in his eyes. This is great, right? Like great body language dialogue note. Don't look at me like that, young man. I couldn't do anything. I swore to your grandfather that Sylvia would never know I was there. But you're showing yourself to me now. I figured the vow was completed when your mother died. That's like his mom just died. That's a heavy thing for her to say. But he moves on. So now what? You're gonna leave to find Peter Pan, right? Like he's moving on to like, oh, let's talk about what you're doing next because you didn't help her. We need to live with this like your mother just died. And she is going to ramp back into it, right? Like, yes, your mother died and I'm the only relative you have, so I'm like your godmother. But here, once you hit this Peter Pan moment, they start moving into what her role is as a fairy, right? So we've got another segment, but this is a big wave crash. It's this huge, like, boom, your mom just died and I watched it happen and I didn't do anything. We got to know how David responds to that emotionally. He needs to stomp around a little bit. He needs to get mad. He needs to yell at her a little bit, or however his character modulates to that moment, right? Like, so how does David modulate when he gets this, when he's reminded of this horrible thing? We need to see that happen here. Does that make sense?
It does.
Before he's able to joke with her about being his fairy godmother.
Yeah.
Right. Like we got to feel the fact that she just said, I watched your mom die.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's all. I think those were the only scene setting things I had. Oh, this is another one. And this one you felt, right? Like you put in this phrase, David looks around the forest. You got to tell me what he sees. Because when you say David looks around the forest, I think of the forest down the street from my house. But I promise that is not what you were intending. So, because you've already told me there's bright colors, like I need to know what his experience in this forest is. And again, I don't need a ton. I just need a couple sentences, like 3 or 4 sentences max, where you're telling me what the texture of the forest is in a way that communicates to me how he feels about being here. Does that make sense?
It does a lot.
Okay. So that's a lot. We talked about finding segments. We talked about dropping scenery and body language into those segments. We talked about finding emotional, like the emotional wave crash, and then telling us how David's feeling. Before I move on to the next thing, any questions about any of that?
No, listen, this is great.
Okay. And like I said at the beginning, dude, I wouldn't do this on my first pass. I would not try to find this stuff on my first pass. I would vomit draft the dialogue like you're doing. Get all the dialogue out. Like you're coming in with your like conflict, choice, and consequences. You're like, I know what I want to get out. And then you're like, okay, and now I'm going to write to those things in the dialogue and get all that out. And the structure is really strong. So I wouldn't mess with that. I would get it all out and then I'd come back to it and be like, okay, in my second pass, where do I need to start creating texture in the box for David, for the reader to experience what David's experiencing? Yeah, I'll just run through a couple so we can move to the next piece because I had almost 0 voice notes here for you. The voices are great. Like it's all really good. She uses the word dum-dum a lot at the beginning. Yeah. Is that intentional or was that just coming up? Okay.
No, that was.
As long as it's a voice note, it's cool. If you weren't doing it on purpose, I'd tell you to take it out. But if you're doing it on purpose, it's okay. So here, this is another major drop. And I got to say, you're dropping a lot of world building here. There's a lot. You may want to break this up into 2 chapters if you can.
Okay.
Um, and I don't mean that like you need 2 full world building chapters. I mean, take out some of this and like give them something else to do and let her reveal some of this and something else to do. Because so far he's learned there's 2 separate worlds. And then he learns he's been spied on that fairies exist. Okay, so there's 2 separate worlds and fairies exist. And that he has a fairy that's been spying on him his whole life, and that fairy can't interfere, but has definitely been watching him, but has now decided to interfere, but let his mom die. So that's 4 pretty big, huge things. Then he learns that the fairy is like feels that she is his protector. So now we're in 5 big like world building things. Then she's going to drop on him that he's not human, that he's a giant, although the giant he's not tall. And then she's going to drop on him the whole idea of natural selection, and that there's like a history of giants, and like this is a thing that happened. Then he's going to get attacked by something in this like world, and he's gonna have to figure all that out, and he's gonna see how powerful she is. So like that's 9 major world building things you're dropping in 1,800 words. So like part of me feels like, can we pull some of this out? Like the conversation about like the giant stuff and like he's not human, does that have to happen here? Or can we like put that like in another chapter, like they're walking around doing something and she's like, well, I mean, you should know you're not human. And he can be like, wait, what? And she can be like, oh, you're a giant. Like, can we fit this in? Anyway, dude, you don't have to have an answer for that now, but just think about like how much of this world building has to happen in this chapter and how much can we like spread out to other places.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. I know that's not a great thing to hear. You're like, I don't want to put it in other places, but
one of the things I'm trying to do here is that she doesn't understand much about the human world, and he doesn't understand anything about the fairy world.
Yeah.
Or Mithala and Thera. So they each think that each other is like dumb or something, because they don't understand what they're talking about.
Oh, it totally comes across. You're doing that really well.
Okay.
It's just, I'm thinking about from your reader's perspective, there's a lot. In 1,800 words, you're like, if you think about it, you're giving me 200 words for each of those major pieces of information.
Yeah.
And that's just not a lot to process. Like the danger here is of giving too much world building at a time is that it all comes out like a big gumbo. Okay. So like in New Orleans, where I grew up, we make gumbo. The joke about gumbo is that it's just whatever's in the fridge. What's in the gumbo? Corn, okra, sausage, shrimp, like whatever's left
whatever
from the last crawfish broil goes in the gumbo, right? Like, so some rice, so that's the like everybody from New Orleans is like, don't ever let Jeff make gumbo. So hot dogs, don't ever let Jeff make gumbo. So all I had to say, like, you don't want this to feel like gumbo, where it's just like, oh man, this is a lot. Like there's a lot happening in this. So let's get strategic about how many of those 9 things need to drop in this chapter. Because I got to tell you, like 5 is enough. Like if you drop 5 of those 9 on me, that's plenty. Like I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. Like you've introduced the 2 different worlds and this character and they're interchanging. So yeah, just thinking about how they interplay with each other, like what's actually necessary. Okay, you've got a joke here about natural selection.
Yeah.
Why didn't you personify natural selection? I was so excited when she personified natural selection.
Actually, when you gave me that note, I said, yeah, that's a great idea. I should use that.
It was great. So I'm just gonna read it for the readers because it's so good.
Yeah.
He's like, I can't be a giant. Why am I not like 12 feet tall? And then she says, yeah, that was true sections ago, but natural selection, capitalized, thought it would be better for your survival to blend in more with humans. At least that's what your father used to say. Do you know who she is? Who? Natural selection. I always thought she was a goddess of some sort. And then she goes off like mumbling about who she thought natural selection was, and he kind of teases her that she doesn't know science. And when he starts teasing her, I was like, oh, I was kind of hoping that natural selection was a goddess, because that would be kind of fun. Anyway, so that was just that has nothing to do with dialogue or anything. That's just as an urban fantasy reader, I was like, that's kind
but
of a
not
fun idea.
I love it. I really love it. I got to put
Yeah. And I kind of want to see her
that
appear in a
there.
scene at some point, making some kind of decision about how something is shaped in his world. Like, that's just something that's one of those stupid urban fantasy things that urban fantasy readers like me absolutely love. It's like this, this doesn't necessarily add to the story, but it's just a dumb thing that, people like me enjoy. Yeah, so we talked about this, about moving this kind of, so in here we're on page 4 now, and you start talking to us about how the two worlds actually overlay each other. And we talked about how that needs to happen much earlier in this section. Your action scene is really great when he's running away. So he realizes he's bleeding. She starts to get scared. She tells him to run. These for me, it felt like kind of a swarm of nanobites from like the 90s. That's a really weird reference. But if you remember like 90s movies, and they were always like, nanotech was always like these little like.
Actually, there. Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. Hey, good job world building. I knew exactly what to imagine in your box. So he jumps in the river, he sticks his hand in, she does the sound blast. This is all great. Like, I had no notes for it. It was really good. I felt his urgency. You can see the difference here though, in how it looks visually to the eye, how you've got some world building in here, how you're helping us understand how he's seen and what's happening, and you've got some movement. You can see the difference from there to here.
Yeah.
Right. Now, again, I don't want you to lose this, but if you add, a paragraph of words here, and then you're adding a paragraph of words here in between these segments, it'll feel and look more like you did down here, which has this wonderful texture, emotional texture to it. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. So down here, you have this wrap-up conversation. I do this a lot with my scenes, and that, especially when I've had a big action scene, I have this internal need as a writer to bring the drama down. So often I'll add an ending conversation, and almost always when I'm editing, I cut it, because you don't really need it. He gets thrown back into the real world, and then he has this conversation about becoming worthy and how he can cross back over on his own. This is a conversation you need to put somewhere else in the book, not here. He can ask her later.
Okay.
Right? You don't need it at this moment. We don't need an 11th world building piece here at the last.
I just wanted to incorporate in there a threshold guardian, which is a tree.
And that's great.
I didn't have any in my book.
Yeah. He asks, we are the guardians. Do not return here. You are unworthy. You are an unworthy creature. The tree said with contempt and a low bass voice in David's chest. Now the tree goes away. That's all I need. Right? The tree stops talking and becomes a tree. And you've introduced the threshold guardian. I don't need this conversation about how do I become worthy.
Okay.
Right. That's where it goes too far, because and the problem is it doesn't feel realistic anymore, because he had this super heightened experience where he thought he was going to die. And then he gets saved and kicked to this other world. To make him feel like an authentic character, he still has to be in this place where he's like, I almost died. And he's going to sit in that place for a while. Right? We don't need to see him sit there, but we just know that man, he's going home and he's taking a nap. Right? This was dramatic. What we don't need is him having a complex conversation about when he's worthy or not worthy.
Okay.
Right? Now, yelling for his fairy to come back, yelling at the sky for her to come back, is great. And ending with this comment, yelling to her And then the last thing he yells is like, how do I get back to Montreal from here? Right? Like that's a great kind of comedic moment, but we want to keep him in that heightened emotional state where he's just like yelling at the sky, not having not asking a tree questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And part of that is this like, so let's go back to the other conversation now and talk about emotional flow. Because I didn't plan that, but man, that's a good transition to talk about emotional flow. So people's emotions move slower than we want them to. Right? Now, you can flip into heightened emotions. You can go from 0 to 60 really fast, but you can't go 0 to 60, 60 to 0. That's not how the human body works. So you can go 0 to 60, and then you're going to slowly come down off that hill. So like if we were writing a horror novel and something jumped out at David and scared the crap out of him, he's not like, now he's not scared anymore. He had the crap scared out of him, and now we're going to slowly come down over that hill of getting the crap scared out of us. So with Claire, she's coming in really hot, right? The rapid fire back and forth is great. We've talked about body language, so I'm not going to get into it here. So right here, we're like a few sentences in, and she's breaking the professional wall.
Yeah.
And what I know you know what I mean by that, but for people listening, Claire's a cop. Cops have rules.
Yep.
Cops can break those rules, but when they break those rules, it has meaning, right? Like it has to mean something.
Yeah.
So either if a cop is breaking the rules all the time, we're like, oh, this is a rogue cop, right? That's, Riggs and Lethal Weapon. Rogue cop breaking the rules all the time. If a cop is good most of the time, or like tries to be good, and then breaks the professional wall in the middle of a conversation, it communicates a modulation. So my question is, do you want this to feel like a build? Is she under control and then she loses it? Or is she lost it from the very beginning?
She lost it from the beginning.
Okay.
Because like I mentioned, her, we talk about Angie.
Yeah.
And David doesn't know this, but Angie that died, okay, and we're going to see it a little bit later in the chapter, was her lover.
Okay.
And he doesn't know this.
So,
and the way
oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm trying to build it is in the chapter later on, we see, I'm putting a red herring here, trying to make her seem like part of the bad guys.
Gotcha. So we need more body language from her to show her agitation.
Okay.
And part of this goes at the beginning, because part of this goes into the like communicating what's happening in your box. So I'm just going to read some of her phrases, and I'll read them in two different ways so you can hear the different ways that a reader could hear these words in their imagination. So you saw Mr. Willoughby. What did you talk about? What else? How long were you in his office? Answer my questions. You're sure about that? What does that mean? What else are you sure about? I don't give a fuck if you like me or not. Right? So you can hear when she breaks the fourth wall, if I'm reading that without the context of body language giving me this emotional texture, that line feels very out of place. Whereas if I'm reading it like, so you saw Mr. Willoughby, or smacking the table. She demanded, so you saw Mr. Willoughby? Yes. What did you talk about? My mother's will. Smacking the table again. What else did you talk about? Right? Like, so getting the heightened, then when she gets to the breaking the professional wall hardcore by dropping the F-bomb, it's not so much a surprise. But you got to give us that emotional texture up front so that we understand that she's already on the edge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So, and that goes into the idea of emotional flow and asking the question, like, how do we want our reader to feel? I was just giving texture to her, you don't have to always give it to her. You can give it to David, and David can translate for us how she's feeling. So you saw Mr. Willoughby, so you saw Mr. Willoughby. Yes, David stammered, unprepared for her aggression. Or like, that's not a great sentence, but you can see how like using David's body language, or yes, David stammered, looking down at the table, hoping to avoid eye contact with her, right? Like you can see how like using his body language can also translate the emotional tone that's going on inside the box, because they're both there. And they're in this, the conversation is this dance, this back and forth. So as she gets aggressive, he's going to respond. He's either going to retreat, which is kind of what you have him doing. He's like backing up, like, slow down, wait a second, or he's going to go in aggressive as well. But as she gets aggressive, he can't not respond. So by telling us what his response is, we also translate her action. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. I also want you to watch, this was a really great build, right? Where, what I like about it, especially in interrogation, is often I'll read interrogation scenes where they get to the answer too quickly. And that almost never happens in a real interrogation. I know that from my day job. There's a lot of dancing around things as the interrogator and the interrogatee feel each other out and try to understand like expectations and norms of this conversation and what are going to be the consequences of this conversation. And you do a really great thing here of like slowing that down. My mother's funeral. Why didn't I see you there when we picked you up? I don't know. I called her and texted her and she never answered. Did you find that odd? Yes, I did. She promised to pick me up and go with me to the service. Why wasn't she there? I don't know. Ask her. Maybe I will. Let me call her. She'll tell you. Maybe later. Am I under arrest? Do I need a lawyer? He took out his phone. I'm calling Mr. Willoughby. You can't do that. I watch TV. I know my rights. I'm allowed one phone call. You can't call Mr. Willoughby because he's dead. So like that big build there is really great. And that like withholding this piece of information where she knows that he's dead and she hasn't told him yet, it is very authentic to an interrogation setting where the interrogator's seeing what the person will reveal about what they already know. So you did a really great job with that. And the slowness, like when we're writing it, it can feel weird because we're beating around this bush and we're like, oh, we're not actually accomplishing the conflict, choices, or consequences. But in this particular setting, it's really great because it's authentic to the moment and resonates in our, in our mind's eye of what this moment's supposed to look like. But then you have this sentence, David's head spun. No. She just told him his lawyer's dead.
Yeah.
He's dead. We need a reaction here. You have it in the dialogue. What? How? When? I just saw him a few hours ago.
Yeah.
I need a full sentence here that gives me or two sentences that gives me his body. What does he do? David's mouth dropped open, and his eyes grew wide. He felt like he couldn't catch his breath. Right? Like we need those like body language things that tell us his heart began to race and a pit formed in his stomach, right? Like those things that tell us like, oh, he's super anxious now. And like something, because if he's not anxious and he's not like devastated, that's what she's actually looking for in an interrogation. She's trying to get him to confess. That's what interrogations are about. Right? Like they're kind of about getting information, but they bring somebody in to interrogate them when they think they've done something. So
Yeah.
she's trying to get information. She's trying to get him to admit to something, or at least to give something away that he wouldn't give in just a normal interview on the street. So when she drops this line, you can't call Mr. Willoughby because he's dead. A good cop is looking for his reaction. How did that information register on his face? What happened right there? Does he look like he knew that already? Is he surprised? Is he not surprised? Like, what's going on? So we need to see, as the reader, we're also watching him to know what's happening because we're in this box with them. So you gotta pump the brakes here. Give us a couple sentences about how he reacts to that knowledge, right? But don't just tell us like David was stunned. Like, you got to show us with body language. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
That was great. Let me see. This is the call and response. We've talked about this before, but this is just a brief place where like we need to see him respond, right? Get out of this room now. Claire Kowalski bolted out and slammed the door behind her. Great, like physical, very succinct, but lets us know how she exits the room. Are you all right? The man asked David, kneeling in the room's corner. And that's David kneeling in the room's corner, but it just needs to be cleaned up a little bit. Then got up and looked at him with despair in his eyes. And then the next line you have is, I'm Captain Monroe. I'm sorry about Detective Kowalski. So, are you all right? The man asked David. This is part of David's response. Kneeling in the corner of the room, David got up and looked at him with despair in his eyes. Right? That would work if you put it on its own line and use it as a line of dialogue. That works. The problem is you suddenly have David in the corner of the room, and I'm not sure when he went there. So we've got to move David to that corner of the room at some point. Because right now he's like magic corner of the room. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's right there where the line starts with, oh my God. Yeah.
You're right. And vomited. Okay. So yeah, you're right. You did get it. I just missed it. Nice job. Okay. Yeah. So that's 100% my fault. Still though, pop this out into its own line. So it feels like part of the dialogue. It feels like David's response, right? Perfect. Then David got it instead of combining it with the captain's response. Yeah. The good cop, bad cop here is great. And it feels very unintentional, which is what you're going for, which is nice. Here, I want you to do the opposite. I want you to keep these on the same line, right? There was a knock at the door and an officer walked in with a Ziploc bag containing a phone and a pair of latex gloves. Excuse me, sir, but you really need to listen to this, right? That's the officer saying that. So just keep it on the same line. Okay. Like, so that we know, because that connects it to us to this action, right? Yeah. Like using your paragraph spacing here as a weapon to like clue in the reader what they're doing is like a weapon to like maneuver around the reader's imagination, allows you to keep that he said, she said out of there, even though you've now moved in briefly to a 3-person conversation, right? So by putting that line here, we don't question who's saying this thing. So moving that line up. I liked the multiple drops in the conversation. It was really great. At the same time, the captain needs to give us some empathy here. So it's not
that I wasn't sure about, because he's part of the bad guys.
Do you want me to know that?
Well, no, not right away.
Okay. True. So then give him.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
If you want me to know that now, you're right. Make him Kingpin in the TV show Daredevil, where he just sits there static and looks at people when he's like, I know you killed your brother, Karen Page. And then she's like having this big emotional reaction and he's just like sitting there looking at her, right? Like if you want to tell us that he's a psychopath, no empathy, but you're not looking to tell us that right now.
No. So and he's not a psychopath. He's just like an informant for the bad guys.
Yeah. So he's totally going to he tells her like, Angie died. And he's like, what? No, Angie? And then the poor captain goes on to describe the death right there too, like just giving him facts. So just give us a couple lines here about what no, Angie, like, I'm sorry to give you this news. I know this is a lot to take at once. And then have him be like, I can't believe it. And like, yeah, I know, he needs to start crying. He needs to be sobbing a little bit, or maybe he vomits again, but he needs to do something that shows us like, oh, this is just too much. And then he can come in, put his hand on his back and give us all of these details, but we just need to stretch that moment out a little bit to get empathy from this character, because otherwise he comes off like a psychopath. Like, I just told you that somebody you care about died, and I don't look, here's the facts, right? Like, cry over there in the
Okay.
corner. I don't care. Yeah. This is just an odd question for him. I know what you're getting at.
Yeah.
That he feels delusional and that he's talking to somebody else. The problem is sorry, people are listening to us talk. You've got this section of the conversation where the fairy starts talking to David, but only David can hear her. And David actually stops talking to the captain and talking to the fairy. And so you want the captain to feel like David's delusional. So he's asking, do you take any medicine? Did I get all that right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is you've written the fairy conversation to David too well, that what David says wouldn't actually clue anybody off to the fact that he's on being delusional, especially after hearing that two of his friends died. He's in shock. He's going to say weird things. So, explain this to me. We get on an average of 2 murders a week, and now in 2 days I have 4 victims each time you were around. 4? Who's the 4th? David said, wiping his eyes. Your mother, Mrs. Wilbridge, Mr. Willoughby, and Mayor McNeil. Who's that? A man that was bored to death in the hospital room. Not another word, said a voice behind him. It would also be good to know how this voice sounds so we can start putting it in our head. Is it high pitched? Is it low pitched? Is it demanding? Is it comforting? Is it a whisper? Is it loud? Startled, David looked behind him and saw no one. What's wrong, David? I have nothing to do with this. Do you take any medicine? Right. So he hasn't been delusional. All he did was like look behind him. He hasn't been delusional enough. And you just told him 4 people died. And he's like, yeah, he's looking everywhere. He's freaking out. So all that to say, the question here, like,
Okay.
This is a little bit giving the captain your knowledge as an author. Right? Like, as the author that David's hearing a fairy.
Yeah.
But the captain doesn't know that.
Yeah.
But you gave the captain the ability to know that. So, I would just pull it out and let the captain continue with the conversation.
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't need to go into that one. That was just a note for you. Again, that was just another note for you. And then I think the rest of this is great. Like we talked about, him leaving is really good. Okay. That was all I had. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, listen, you gave me a lot of material to work on, and I always love working with you.
Yeah, this is what happens when you send me 2 scenes at one time, man. You're going to get like 1,000 notes at once.
Yeah, but my purpose here is to learn, and that's what I'm doing.
Good. Yeah. And I think they're really strong. Your writing's coming a really long way. It's nice to see you grow as a writer. And this is a fun book. I'll read this book when you get it done and it comes out. It's a good, solid urban fantasy. It's a lot of fun.
Great.
So nice work.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to kill the recording. We can talk a little bit more.
Okay, great.